Well, we've already considered, at least in passing, the nature of structural canonicity, the implication of which is that each monument built in a canonical group is essentially the same as the other monuments in the group, certainly more like them than like anything else. And this is a version of the Brock, not that. This is a version of the Brock. This drawing of a Brock is very close to what I conceive the canonical Brock to be. Clearly, without some consistency of attributes, monuments would all be sui generis and no grouping of types would be possible, and no discussion of the subject would be possible other than by tedious recitation, as I'm doing now. So some level of canonicity is essential to our efforts to categorize monuments. The architectural, Cummings, writing in 2016, suggested that similarities in use, I beg your pardon, she suggested that the monuments are obviously important to people. I'm going to try a whole sentence now. She actually suggested that similarities in form, setting, and use of the monuments was obviously important to the people building the monuments, or we should expect to see much more diversity. That's true. However, similarities in use are mnemonic or mnemosaic suppositions, not attributes. And the setting of a monument is not a self-evident attribute because it's an issue of individual judgment. And thus, they do not offer support to a taxonomic process. But we are all, I think, agreed, at least, that form is an important real-world phenomenon. And to quote McFadden and Whittle, form mattered in building. It both imposed limitations to the construction process and it opened possibilities, they say. The architectural relationship between form and function is often expressed in the formula form follows function, especially by advocates of modernism. The architect Louis Sullivan is credited with the creation of this expression. He used to say that form ever follows function, my dear man, to convey the idea that the shape of the object is primarily determined by its intended function. Going back to our evolutionary, unhelpful evolutionary models, it's interesting that Lamarck was happy to suggest that function during an organism's life would affect the form of the next generation. This is rejected by Darwinians, of course, who conversely argue that variation for them comes from the intermixing of genes between parents, and that new forms are conserved if they enable organisms to function better and thus be more successful in reproduction, and so on and so on. If a particular design is too successful, very successful, or if the stabilizing influences are too strong, and here you could think in biology of sharks and crocodiles who haven't changed since God was in short trousers, any change would be difficult or impossible. And in fact, change is difficult in all social processes. Raymond Loewy, one of the fathers of American industrial design, in fact, a very brilliant man, I think, he developed what he called the Maya principle, M-A-Y-A. He said that what you got away with in design was the most advanced yet acceptable design, which was always going to be a compromise between the most functional design, which is actually available to you, and the design which would cause the least social rejection. He suggests in terms then that social acceptability applies an inertial break on random variations in form. This comment goes back to my earlier suggestion today that any evolutionary or developmental process requires a technique that generates new forms or offers new forms, but it also requires consolidation on optimal forms. And here's good old Loewy saying, yeah, that's true, but it's always perhaps a compromise, which is far from rational in some cases. The most advanced the most functional means of disposal of the dead in the Neolithic, apart from simple abandonment to surface decomposition, may originally have been the cave. And of course, many examples exist in the British Isles. Cooney in 2016 lists quite a lot for Ireland, the use of caves for burial. Use of constructed underground hypogea or catacombs can be argued to be advanced forms of disposal in caves. I have a friend who maintains that all of architecture is in fact an attempt to build a better cave. That may have been true about burial monuments as well. However, it's notable that many postmodern scholars do not in general consider the social contexts of corporeal disposal in terms of the function of disposal, but seem instead to prefer putative social contexts of imagined ceremonials associated with the acts of disposal, or alternatively some unspecified social quality of the process of site selection for the building of specialized monuments that deal with the dead. Society can and does initiate change, alter the expectations of the changes, as well as resist all change to some extent. The introduction of new forms into established building traditions can give rise to unique forms, unique in the sense that they are neither the old form which was desired, nor yet wholly new forms. Oosterhout has described the rise of regional style in terms of local craft responses to newly introduced Byzantine briefs for church building in Anatolia. He emphasizes the role of the commissioning agent, often a churchman and not an Anatolian either, but also the professional functionary on the ground who may have been an architect on architectural dragoman or master builder at the higher level, the regional journeyman masons, and the local trade subcontractors, all of whom act as filters through which that original design brief has to work its way to a conclusion. Oosterhout emphasizes the creative tensions that arise from the commissioning agent's requirement for novelty from a de facto traditionalist workforce. These interactions gave rise, in the example he has explored, to a distinct regional Anatolian sub-style of an otherwise canonical Greek model Byzantine church. So the knowledge base of the building practitioners may operate as a brake on perfect transmission of a concept from one region to another, and may operate also in the creation of new regional styles as hybrids between some externally desired optimum and the mea, the maximum available contribution they could make to that was still acceptable. Brocks. We now turn to Brock Towers, and if I use the Brock Tower, if I use the term Brock throughout this talk, as I've said earlier, I'm talking only about Brock Towers. The idea of a Brock class, which is inclusive of all curvilinear stone face structures, is, I have argued, at best a failed axiomatic taxonomy, and at worst simply nonsense. For want of time, I will advance a postulate here, the founding evidence for which you can find in my PhD thesis, which is in the University of Edinburgh. The postulate is that Brocks are canonical structures, all built to the same form in the same general way, and this illustration, by and large, shows the main features of what I consider to be the canonical Brock Tower. I call it the revised standard model because there was Alan Braby's representation of Brocks constituted the sort of paradigmatic idea of what a Brock should be up to about 2012. I then revised that in the light of information which is actually available then, but hadn't made its way into consciousness, and also in the light of my own field work. I have two qualifiers on that postulate. The first one is scale variance. It'll be obvious, as they say, even to the meanest intellect, that Brocks cannot be scaled down indefinitely. And the reason why is the inner wall, which is 94 centimeters thick, and the gallery inside it, which is 93 centimeters thick, on average, over something like about 30 or 40 blocks. How reliable these dimensions are, we could talk about a lot more. And we did speak about the difficulties of the metrics of monuments earlier. But they set practical lower boundaries on scale. Building a thinner, self-loaded inner wall is challenging anyway, and because its ground loading would increase exponentially. Imagine, we introduced the elephantine scale of ground loading, okay? And we said that in a small block, a relatively small block anyway, the pressure on the ground for each square meter is 3 elephants. By the way, they are African elephants, they're not Indian elephants. I just want to be very clear about that. Well, imagine the 3 elephants somehow managing to stand on a 1 square meter plate. If we now cut that in 4, so we have 4 50 centimeter plates, and we put our mass onto one of those, the pressure being exerted is 12 elephants, not 3, because it's on a quarter of the footprint. So if we reduce the inner wall, we increase its ground loading, and I'll show you later, the ground loadings of the inner walls were always at, relatively speaking, critical levels. Ground loading is the stress that a given substrate, yes, again, I fear that I may cause number panic in the audience, but just ignore the numbers. They're really there just as a decoration. The literature, when I started, suggested that blocks could have radii anywhere between 3.5 meters and 7.5 meters, and that the outer wall face could slope inwards out of the vertical by amounts between 10 degrees and 25 degrees. I did not dismiss any of the large values, which seemed irrational even then, because I didn't want to be selective in dealing with the evidence. From that, I've been able to calculate, as it were, various parameters for this range of monument type, of monument proportions. I've said that the smaller blocks can't be built because the ground loading is too small. And anyway, why would you build a gallery that was so narrow that nobody could ever get into it? Having looked at some of the Western Isles galleries, maybe they did it anyhow. So I suggest that there are no blocks built with those proportions, the sort of golden colour, and then there's a lighter colour out here. I'm colourblind, so you're going to have to make up the colours as you go along. I'm going to tell you what I believe they are. Over here in this band, we have blocks that are between 12 and 15 metres high. And in there, we have a range of blocks that are buildable. I suggest that the golden group could not be built, that the lighter yellow group are their building is improbable, certainly difficult, and that the buildable range is all of the ones in that white valley there and this grey valley here. You'll understand later why I cut this out. Right. These are measures of ground loading expressed in our good old friends, the kilopascal. But again, because of number panic, I've re-expressed them in elephants here. These are elephant equivalents in the right-hand column. Ground loading is the stress that a given substrate can endure before it yields, causing structures built upon it perhaps to experience cracking and structural failure. Note that even if you meet the threshold or exceed the threshold value for one of these substrate types, these are soil types and rock types and so on, it doesn't automatically mean that the building is going to fall down. What it does mean is that the building probably will fall down, and if you keep making it heavier, it definitely will fall down. Okay? It's not a cut-off, it's not a shotgun threshold. I selected 2 thresholds, the 150 or the, let's say the 3 elephant pressure at the bottom, and the 10 elephant pressure up there towards the middle. These are at medium dense gravels and so on. Because between them, if we go beyond 3 elephants, we would place ourselves outside the ability of most Scottish soils successfully to support the Broch. And at 150, we rule out all of the less cohesive soils. So I've picked those two somewhat arbitrarily as thresholds of interest. Now, right. Again, ignore the numbers. It's the general picture we're looking at here. You should be able to see, I think, a double red line that does that here and the same somewhere over there. Oh, it's in the middle over there. And you see this solid red block of colour up here. The red line divides, the ones on the left and below are less than or critical 3-elephant threshold, and the ones above the red that are up into the red area are above our 10-elephant threshold, and the ones in between are in the sort of safe zone between 3 and 10 elephants worth of pressure. You can see that the 3-elephant equivalent threshold is such that for many sedimentary rocks, the ground loading ice, the ones on the, does it say that? Yes, the ground ones on the left, the sedimentary rocks are on the left, metamorphic and volcanic built rocks are on the right. For many of them, the ground loading of the inner wall was already quite challenging for most Scottish soils and already at criticality for some of them. For metamorphic and volcanic stone-built rocks, the issue is more severe and the inner wall is at criticality throughout. With increasing Broch size, the challenge to stability becomes greater, and of course, so does the cost of building. You remember the power law that every time we double something on the ground, we increase its volume 8-fold. So the tendency to have a wide range of size is constrained at the lower end by buildability of the model, and at the upper end by the inherent difficulties of ground loading. This is a constraint on building which is not social. It depends on, I suppose other than that, it's social in the sense that it's the monument design which terminates it at the lower end, but it's certainly not at the upper end. It's the ability of the ground to bear the monument. My second qualifier is that of lithological variance. You will know that different rocks have different weights. Caithness flagstone weighs 2.2 tons or 2,200 kilos per cubic metre. A comparable value for volcanic and metamorphic rocks would be 2.6 tons, which is 2,600 kilos per cubic metre. And there are much heavier rock types. To quarry, transport and build in stonework requires energy, and we can consider 3 types: human energy, animal effort, and cartage. Over the course of a day, humans can continuously manipulate 20 kilo loads, animals up to 100 kilo loads, and carts are limited by the carrying capacity of their wooden axles to about 800 kilos, which is, in fact, which has to take in the tare weight of the cart. All of this means that while weight is what costs effort in building, volume is what makes bigger blocks. And so for the same weight stroke effort, we only get 82% of the block in hard rocks that we would get for the same weight and effort of a sedimentary block. So the hard rock rocks are always going to be about 20% smaller for the same investment of effort. Using a numerical methodology based on these factors, I've estimated the minimum costs of building for known blocks, and the example I'll just show you is this group of 3: Gorness, Duncalloway, and Midhow. The fine detail of this you can ignore, but essentially their building cost in person days, raw working days, are set out here, and it places them very close to each other in terms of their construction costs. Gorness is 6% more expensive than is 6% more expensive, and Midhow is 3% less expensive than Duncalloway. Despite the manifest differences between them in the field, they represent a very similar level of social investment as represented by construction costs. And I have to say that for me, this was an unanticipated conclusion. They seem enormously different to me. I have the impression in my head that Duncalloway is a titchy wee thing. that Gurness is bigger and a bit more robust, and that Midhow is enormous, and yet they are not. The observation that West Coast brocks, for which read brocks built with volcanic and metamorphic rock types, and we can say the same about quite a few of the Shetland rocks as well, the observation that they are smaller than the East Coast sedimentary brocks is commonly interpreted as the result of some socio-cultural choice that differentiates between them. However, in socio-economic terms, there is no such differentiation. Now, at the risk of sounding like a social determinist, I want to explore the significance of this observation a little further, advancing a second postulate, which is that all human effort can be reduced to costs in terms of the energy required to make that effort. Thus, the energy required to produce an object is a measure of its production cost. In less complex societies, this might also be a measure of its value, but in more complex societies, other parameters, including aesthetics, rarity, exoticism, or sales blurbs, may influence the quantum of that value. In subsistence societies, if they ever existed, it is argued that humanity produced what it consumed and consumed what it produced without significant surplus or shortage. This is a fairy tale, but it's the definition. However, to build a broch required non-productive energy expenditure on a pretty generous scale. To the society involved, this is of course a double cost, because you not only have to spend energy on the building project, but you have to bear the opportunity cost of not spending it on what you had previously spent it upon. Every choice you make bears the cost of the equivalent choice that you didn't make. This is a standard economics concept. Whatever its scale, the available energy, like disposable income, is a function of the size of the community involved, because it's the sum of the individual surpluses that the population has. It's remarkable to me then that Callaway, Midhow and Gurness have such similar volumes of disposable energy stroke income. Is it possible, we may ask, that social groups across the north of Scotland capable of building brocks were approximately of constant size? If so, may we also anticipate, of constant size, I don't mean to the person now, but I mean, constant, of similar scale, that the community groups are of similar scale. If so, we may also anticipate, that the social model would have tended to produce largely similar social groups. Now, recall, if you will, that in the early medieval records of law tracts and so on, they mandate certain numbers of clients for specific levels of aristocracy. Now, while these describe an ideal that was probably never fully realized anywhere, they nonetheless indicate a thought process for, implying that something of this order did actually exist. And this also would have controlled society's grain size in Iron Age society. Pache, Mallory and his cohort of early medieval conspiracy theorists. I would further suggest that in the aggregate, such meta-equivalent social groups might have constituted the sorts of farming republics which have been described by Alex Wolff and James Fraser, amongst whom the farmers in the republic from time to time, amongst the farmers in the republic, a primus inter pares would arise to local prominence. And for ambitious members of that group, of the republic, the possession of a broch tower may have become an entry-level requirement for membership of the group credibly aspiring to leadership roles. Having allowed then the physical constraints of scalability of the broch and noted the constraints implicit in that on their social underpinnings, and I want to abandon this, this conversation and move on to a consideration of the monuments themselves. First of all, a brief note on monuments and conservation. Conservation may be described, and you'll see the reason why I want to address conservation early here is because this concept of WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. Well, it ain't true with ancient monuments, and it certainly isn't true about brocks, and I hope I'll be able to show you that. So conservation is what conspires to produce what we look at, and which, if we observe it uncritically, is going to mislead us. Right. Conservation may be described as all those works undertaken to secure the survival of the cultural value of a place that is a heritage asset. Remember that cultural value means the capacity of the monument to inform this and future generations. So it's the information content of the monument vested in the physical remains of the monument, which is important. All conservation theories require as a first principle that we know what the object is whose cultural value we seek to conserve. It will be clear that no monument, however constructed, survives to us in precisely the form in which it was constructed. The second law of thermodynamics rules that out. Everything tends from order to chaos. It's the way the universe works. It's a bit like, no, I'm not going to say that. A common form of decomposition curve is a negative hyperbolic curve. You have very rapid deterioration at first, and then it levels out and may never reach zero, or may only reach zero at infinity. Okay? All sorts of things decay in this way, everything from large buildings to us. Human beings, human intervention can change that, as we just fleetingly saw. And of course, maintenance and repair, if you build an iron-edged block and then it sort of starts to disintegrate and you build it back up again, you can arrest the rate of decline. And if you have a significant rebuild, you can push back to a higher plane, the position from which the decomposition begins. Related to that is an idea of complexity, which is something in information theory which we'll ignore. And at the bottom is information content, which waxes and wanes with the decomposed state of the monument. In spite of this complex set of interrelationships in decomposition, we can also arrive at stable states, which can be semi-permanent, or pretty nearly permanent anyhow, but which are all really dynamic balances. But an example that's important to us now is for Brocks, that because they're such big buildings, that significant parts of the Brock can survive within the decomposition of the rest of the Brock. This is the Brock at Clachtow, which colleagues and I excavated, I can't remember when, but that was full to the top with decomposition products. And there's now a 7-meter high wall there, which none of us, to be fair, expected to find, but there it is. Regardless of hiatuses in decomposition, everything does actually fall apart eventually. And Byron had it right. Sadly, they all decompose. Now, I'm going to go back now to 3 sort of very brief case studies of Carloway, Midhow, and Gurness, to which we've already referred, to establish the point that Brock remains, especially those which we have excavated and conserved for presentation, far from telling the simple stories that are proposed for them, are truly complex monuments. And in the next lecture, I will look at the more recently excavated sites of Old Scatness, Thrumster, and Clachtow to explore the conservation challenges encountered there. But here I want you simply to see the scale and the nature of the changes wrought over time. The remains at Duncarloway are well known and generally discussed as a single period monument which, dilapidations accepted, are relatively unaltered from their original state. Mackenzie in 1792 published a sketch that had been prepared for him of the monument. This illustrates 2 stacked voids there. There's a wee entrance to the stair cell. There's the stair cell. And the second stacked void should be about there. But it isn't there. Now, there's abundant, if unreliable, evidence in the masonry particularly in that image there, you can see that there are dark patches of masonry. There's something going on there and there. Patterns of masonry seem to suggest that the fabric was altered here. But madness lies in the direction of believing that patterns of masonry can reliably tell us anything. If you take the junctions between stones as choices going forward, you only have to meet 13 choices before you have 20 million separate ways of getting from there to there. So you can read anything you like into this tapestry. Right. In the 1890s, I have no idea what that is. Oh, yes I do. No, I haven't. I don't know what that's doing. I'll try the next slide. This has somehow dumped the image, and I don't know why, but I'll describe the image here. If you flatten out Duncalloway and take away the inner wall, you would see that there are two separate systems of floor levels that were in originally to subdivide galleries. And they're not consistent with each other. The stairway for one of them is blocked by the gallery floor of the other. This was the work undertaken. I mean, this illustration, if we could see it, was prepared by Captain Thomas, who was actually a reliable observer. And I have shown on the right here that the modern, the surviving structure bears out his contention. That cannot have conceivably worked with that, because presumably that stairway continued up here somewhere. And there's a stairway there, there's another stairway down here, and again, these collide over here somewhere. The conflict between the floor levels within the wall thickness at Duncalloway implies that there's a first organisation which, for whatever reason, fell apart or was superseded in some way by a second organisation, which leaves redundant bits of masonry hanging about the place. That can only happen if there's a severe loss of wall at some stage, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The surviving stair, which is entered via the 12 o'clock cell, Brock directions are given by assuming that the entrance to the Brock is at 6 o'clock in a clock face, and the other bits are at the various time intervals around the Brock. The surviving stair at Duncalloway is entered through the 12 o'clock position, rising clockwise from inside the cell entrance. The stair is clearly, and I definitely could show you that picture, or maybe not. There are clearly 4 separate bits of stair bolted together here. The lower 7 steps are horizontal but slewed and largely disengaged from the outer wall face. From the outer wall's inner wall face. There's an apparent landing of 5 approximately level slabs. There's a set of 9 steeply dipping and broken steps terminating.
This isn't working. We'll have to take it upstairs and try something else.
Okay. There's a set of 9 steps steeply dipping and broken beyond that, and above that there are a set of 4 approximately horizontal slabs completing the stairway. I think that the upper lot are modern. But the stairway implies that there are at least 3 episodes of building and rebuilding, while the state of the 9 sloping and broken steps implies an intervening period of major structural distress. Now, the scale of the displacements evidenced in that masonry is sufficiently large enough for us to expect some evidence of displacement on the outer side of the outer wall. And when you look at that, the wall is a mess. There are building planes all the way through it. Now, I've said how unreliable that is as a source of evidence, but it's clear that when you have such disturbed masonry, something has happened. My suspicion is that the outer wall face was built onto a soil. If the rock slope at Duncarloway is like that. The outer wall came out here when there was soil here. I think that wedge of soil has slid away, and the outer wall has gone with it in part. Now you may feel that, of course, if that happened, the whole wall would fall. But my next slide would show you that dry stone-built walls are remarkably self-healing. You can make a great big hole in a dry stone wall, and the masonry up above it just bridges over. You have sort of loose masonry up here, and then the masonry above is undisturbed, and the hole is down here. And we can have holes, and we can see them in some monuments like Musa. There was a huge hole above the current entry, where there was a higher level entry. We can see the same at Duntell, where that hole has been blocked in, but there's a bulge in the wall above the entrance where that was rebuilt. So it is possible to have substantial voids pushed through the masonry of dry stone structures without losing the overall integrity of the monuments. And then finally, I wanted to show you, as my next slide will show you, that at each one of the voids, at each one of the cell entrances at the ground level in the interior of the Broch at Duncarloway, there is in fact a stacked void above it. All of them have been infilled by overactive underachievers. I don't know what, I presume they've been filled in order to stabilize the masonry on either side, to prevent it from moving. And that used to be the sort of big Bible of conservation of dry stone structures, make sure that nothing can move. But in stabilizing them, they've actually hidden features. This is not a new observation. And Ewan Mackay, for example, has railed against the difficulties created at Carnlea, where, amongst other things, he comments on the loss of the bar hole in the entrance passage since 1909, and early photographs, in comparison with the arrangement of the stair foot at Carnlea, shows that that's been hugely remodeled as well. Ewan comments further on this and several other monuments in his 2002-2007 corpus, which is worth a look at. Alexandros Veloudis, who is an engineering master's student at Edinburgh Asala across the road here, he further explored the subject, observing additional examples of the occlusion or the alteration of existing features in this way. He says, with the youthful enthusiasm that only the youth can have, some of them have clearly had restoration work done, and it is evident today, while others project a much more complicated image that is almost unreadable. In some cases, any modifications are unrecorded, either because it was considered unnecessary at the time or due to human error. I think he's quite right. Here you see this conflation or confusion of levels within Carloway. Yeah? There's clearly two separate tectonic schemes going on there. Architectural tectonics, the word tectonic is used very widely in architecture, and it means almost everything. Generally speaking, it conveys the idea of the way in which human beings articulate with the totality of the thing that's been built. And it implies that that totality is greater than the sum of its parts. There are two separate tectonic schemes in here, is the point I was making. Yes, I'm going to use that for next. Yes, there's the multivariate staircase. There's the upper levels where the outer wall has clearly dropped a little bit and moved anti-clockwise, shredding some of the lintels up there. And here's the highly variable outer wall face just outside that inner rearrangement, all of which points, as I argue, to a collapse. Here are the missing voids, and I've put in these blue marks to represent the bits of masonry that are, in my opinion, clearly new. And just to show that I'm not being ridiculous about it, here's a picture from the Royal Commission's 1928 volume, which shows that void still open. So the progressive reinforcement There's a disease called Botrytis xerotica obliterans. It's a disease in which skin grows over other organs and obscures them. This is masonry BXO. And we need to discourage it. That leads me on then to a suggestion or a recommendation, which I will make to HES one day. There's a process been imposed on the construction industry now called BIM. I think it's Building Information Management, and it means that they've got to record everything from the original design stages through all of the construction on into maintenance works and alterations over time, so that there's a complete documented history of the building. For large, complex, modern buildings, it's clearly essential. Otherwise, you end up with big fires and tower blocks. English Heritage has responded to this by creating something they call HBIM, Historic BIM, in which they propose to do the same thing. And it would be an enormous boon to scholarship and to posterity if we would do the same for historic and prehistoric buildings in Scotland. That's the end of the advertisement. Now, Midhow Broch. The Brochs at Gurness and Midhow, having carefully arranged to have my phone beside me to give me an indication of time, I've forgotten to switch it on. I don't know whether I'm ahead or behind time. If you get bored, just wave at me and I'll stop. The Brochs at Midhow and Gurness lie within sight of each other across Einhallow Sound in Orkney and are so structurally similar that it would be hard to refute a claim that they were built by the same people, or at least under the same direction. Their construction histories are very similar, and they share early failures, followed by many successive interventions ranging in scale from minor repairs to major remodelings of the accessible ruins. Midhow is a large and complex monument and deserves consideration in a lecture all of its very own. So here I'm just going to extract a couple of points relating to modifications from the original Broch form. The first relates to the modification of stacked voids. These are stacked voids. It's metaphysically impossible to stack voids, is my belief. But nonetheless, these are stacked voids, and they are weight-relieving devices to make sure that the mass of the wall up here doesn't rest on these lintels. Right, you'll have seen them. Those are very long ones, which usually you find over the entrance, over the doorway at the stair cell entrance, and at a higher level at the top of the stair, really at the stair head, plus 1 or 2 meters. That gives access out into the space within the Broch onto a floor or whatever, resting on the scarcement. That's where we find them. But it's clear, and you saw this at Duncalloway earlier, that even the smaller cell entrances have stacked voids to protect their lintels. There isn't any other way to do it. If you put that much masonry on a stone lintel, it's just going to fall apart. It's just not going to, it won't be able to take it. Tensile strength, remember. Put the weight on top, you pull the bottom apart, and stones are very, very weak in tension. Now, where did I get to? Okay. Yes. Opposite the entrance at Midhow, there's this sort of doorway high up here. You'll see that the right-hand side of it inclines towards the middle at about 15 degrees, and stacked voids incline towards the middle at between 10 and 20 degrees. And I'm reasonably happy that that's the edge of a stacked void. That's vertical, but you can see over there that this is a new block of masonry put in the construction of a relining of the Broch by that wall face. My point is, this was a door to the stairwell and had a stacked void above it in the original construction, but that's now masked by these subsequent modifications. That doorway gives us access in here, and you can come in here to see this dotted line. That's a sort of a cell. It's described as a gallery in the excavation report without any acknowledgement of the fact that it doesn't match the floor, it doesn't match the lintels or slabs in the floor, which are the roof of the lower gallery and the floor of the next gallery. And not only that, but it cuts out almost to the wall face. And if you did that in a standing block, it wouldn't stay standing for very long. So this is clearly a secondary thing. And looking at it with my colleagues Graham Cavers and Gemma Hudson one evening, we came to a eureka moment in discovering that that's not a Brock feature. It's a souterrain dug in from above when the Brock was encapsulated in a deepening mound of its own detritus. Right. Oh, I don't know if I'm clicking the right button or not anymore. Oh, I'm not. I'm going to click that one. Yes. Yes, there's the souterrain, which has a little crawlway that extends it beyond what was excavated. So what's reported in the excavation report ends there, but subsequently this little crawlway was discovered into another space in here, which is incomplete. Now, this one. I'll turn quickly to the Aumbry, as it's called, or cupboard, wall cupboard, which I think is at about the 3 o'clock position at Midhow, and it's identified as a cupboard or an Aumbry. As you can see, it's a metre or so above, somewhat less than a metre above ground level. And if you get into it and can photograph it, you will discover that you have building breaks on each side where the gallery once passed through. And when you look up the inside, you're looking up into what's left of another stacked void. And in case you don't believe me, here's a scan, laser scan, which we can jig to make it into an X-ray of the building. Here's the entrance to that, here's its lintels, and here's the ope that went up between the two walls when that was part of a stacked void. That's now capped off with sort of rubbled masonry, jumbled masonry up there. And this elevated scarcement rests on and is embedded in that masonry. So rather than being an anomaly, you know, a sign of heterogeneity in the form of this Brock, this is a confirmation that it adhered to the original configuration of the RSM, the Ur Brock, as it might be. This bizarre high scarcement runs across the entrance, as the scarcement always does. However, I don't know what to push. I need my grandson here. You can see in the entranceway there, look, and up there as well, that the original lintels to the entrance passage have been slapped out, leaving tusking on that side, and voids and broken lintel stubs on the other side. And if we look then at the little thumbnail from the excavation report, we see that in fact the original entrance lintel suite came in here, and this is the level at which the scarcement would have sat. My supposition is that the ground level here rises from a mixture of collapse and settlement detritus. They slap out the lintels here, and they push the scarcement level up here, up to this level. And that combination of circumstances of an elevated scarcement, a savagely modified entrance passage, and evidence of raising of the ground floor inside, we can see it at several Brocks. It's certainly at Musa, and it's very clearly here, and there's evidence for it, less clear, but there is evidence for it also at Gurness, thrown across the water. So this middle, we have to imagine, as it were, that the Broch, people living in their own detritus, actually getting rubbish out of the Broch would always have been a big problem. It's like living in a flat in the new town, you know. They rose up inside on a column of their own debris, and they simply moved the entire tectonics of the structure up with them. This happens necessarily early in the existence of the monument because they're recreating a Broch. They're not making something different. And the same may be true, I think, for the other Brochs in which we see this phenomenon. Now, here's the Midhoe Chimera. Midhoe was excavated by a farmhand who worked for Grant, the whiskey man. In a couple of weeks, he threw out, in a couple of years, he threw out 1,500 or 2,000 tons of material, including all the primary archaeological evidence for the monument. And he created this. And this has been maintained with modifications ever since by Historic Scotland as a property and care. But before 1930, nobody ever saw this monument. This is a creation, a piecemeal creation that modified as the floor levels rose and as the wall head dropped, so that the settleable band contracted over time. And those modifications, I mean, there are things like, there was a hearth site there, you know, on top of that in the excavation. The settleable component of the monument modified with time. And this is a highly dynamic structure in that sense, but it's presented as a fait accompli. Here it is. And the sad part is that although that's perhaps a necessary dumbing down to enable us to condescend to the population at large, it actually has become the credo in the academic profession as well. And we have students who believe that this is how the thing was built. We actually have some academics who believe that it's how it was built as well. But Brian is a greater authority on that than I am, so we can look to him for support in there. These are chimera, I guess is my point. And I'll perhaps come back to it, come back to that subject again. Here's Gurness across the other side of Einhallow Sound, viewed from the Sound. It's an interesting monument. It's surrounded by valla and heavily encumbered with small buildings around it. Here's a laser scan of it in its current incarnation. And you can see there what look like elements of a lobed building, of perhaps what's being called a pictish form, or jelly baby buildings, or cellular buildings. I don't know what they're called anymore. But there it is there. And again, like the souterrain in Midhoe, this was dug into a very large mound that had grown up around this monument. And the bulk of this, presumably, is out here somewhere. Now, I want to look again at building dynamics here. And I've got the wrong button again. Here's the wall, the internal wall, unrolled relative to the central spine, vertical spine of symmetry of the monument. And in the bottom part here, it's been color-coded for the distance of the wall, of the separate data points from that central pin, if you like, around which the monument is built. And essentially what it's telling you is that the internal walls lean out very badly, but not entirely proportionately around the course of the Broch. You can see here that in some places the sag of the wall is very distinct. The ranging rod there is vertical. I think that, yes, there's a spirit level taped to it there, in which you can, with suitable enlargement, to verify that to your own heart's content. So the wall is leaning out dramatically. Now, John Hedges suggests, I think specifically, that it was built like this. And I take issue with it because if you go to the entrance, here's the inner right-hand side of the entrance passage. That's a photograph, that's a laser scan. Looking at the photograph, you can see that that wall is leaning inwards at almost 22 degrees. The average outward, is leaning outwards, away from the centre of the broch. The average inclination is 9.25 degrees. The door has sort of closed towards the top, and so the door lintel has tipped down. That's then been corrected. With masonry here, and a level platform formed up here, above which an upper part of the wall has been constructed, which is kind of almost nearly vertical. It isn't really, but it's a lot better than that wall. And the gallery here has been infilled, and a circular house was built on top of that there at a later stage. There is no way that that degree of lean is compatible with the survival of the inner wall of a tower. It just could not happen. And you certainly could not build it like that. It would be like asking somebody to build the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It has ended up the way it is. It would be very hard to build it the way it is. Impossible. Impossible, in fact. Now, on a more humble scale, I like this little picture because here's an earth-fast orthostat which has been cut to shape on its inner edge to receive these little bits of stone. You can see that these stones are in 1, 2, 3, 4 orientations. And I think they represent corrections as the inner wall has moved away from them. The upper ones are really nicely horizontal, so I presume that they were put in by HGS at some stage. But the wall is still moving away. If there's any betting members in the audience, I'd be prepared to wager significantly that the end of Maeshowe is, I keep calling it Maeshowe, I mean Midhowe, that the end of Midhowe cannot be indefinitely delayed. Now, finally at this is Gurness. This is Gurness. I'm sorry, I'm tired and I'm not making sense to anybody. This is the Wallhead Walk, supposedly at Gurness. This up here is called a gallery by John Hedges and Ewan Mackay. It's 500 millimeters high. It's a gallery for really short people. I think they're nowadays called PORGs, persons of restricted growth. When we look at that on top, we discover that it is linteled over like this, and this is the Wallhead Walkway, which is supposed to have been in some way a design feature of the monument. And Angus Graham founds on this to some extent to support his idea that some brocks are only built 2 stories high. Underneath a packing of slabs, stone slabs, which sit between the 2 wall faces, they're not embedded in the wall faces, we find at a lower level these, here they are, look, rather crude and often broken and displaced slabs. And these are the original lintels for the top of the ground gallery and the floor of the second gallery. And this is post-collapse infill and remodelling of the wall head of the broch. It's not a broch feature. Further along from there, you can see, maybe over there, can you see these stones? They have fallen in that nice stacked way that used to be said when you saw that at chambered cairns, that it was ritual blocking of the chambered cairn. It's what happens when a corbelled or when a stone wall collapses under certain conditions, where you have a hinging fault and it falls in. You end up with neatly stacked stone blocks there. These, I think, have remained in position because the inner wall has bulged out over them, making them immovable. You couldn't take them out now without risk to life and gain. All of this goes to the issue that Gurness failed gloriously. I'd love to have seen it come down. It failed because of the inherent limitations of the monument itself. And most of the features, is it true to say this? Yes, many of the features that we now observe in Gurness are secondary and they are non-Brock features. Okay. In general, with looking at these monuments, I have tried to convince you that Brocks, a bit like voting in Northern Ireland, they failed early and they failed often. And for a period, they were reinstated as Brocks and presumably operated within the original Brock tectonics. Their subsequent reuse in village-like arrangements in the East Coast phenomenon, is an East Coast phenomenon which is not reflected in the Brocks of the West Coast. I suggest that Brocks, given their high canonicity, were all built within consistent farming republic territories, and that the East Coast developments, rich in artifacts and secondary structures, was a later cultural development which simply did not find scope for its wholesale deployment on the West Coast. In plain English, when I'm suggesting over the whole territory of the Atlantic Brock distribution, they were all built in a culturally coherent territorium. And then subsequently, on the East Coast, something different happens. I think that what happens is that, just as I've suggested, Brocks are an expression of the emergence of primus inter pares type local potentates in a farming republic of the sort advocated by Alex Wolff and James Fraser. That was what was going on over that whole territory. On the East Coast, it went another stage. And instead of having just primus inter pares, you had super primus inter or over the pares. You began to get some deepening of the social triangle on the East Coast. That gave them access to larger disposable wealth, allowed them to trade with the South, to acquire the sort of gewgaws that we love so much, and to acculturate in a way that simply doesn't really happen on the West Coast. The West Coast didn't find that social deepening, and it may well be because the land values there are so isolated. You can have a patch of good land. You can have a patch of good land, and then you've got all sorts of nonsense, and then you have another patch of good land there and a patch of good land there. Whereas on the East Coast, you have far larger territories within which a higher social pyramid can be erected. I haven't commented on the so-called Brock villages. I've spent about 6 months trying to find evidence to suggest that the Brock villages are contemporary with the Brocks, and I can't find any. I'm now going to invite anybody who believes they are to tell me what that evidence is, because I clearly don't know it. And when I'm talking about evidence, I'm not talking about inference. I'm not talking about arguments that because the vallum is concentric with the Brock, they must be the same thing. For sure, that's logical, I don't think. So I don't see evidence that the Brock villages started as Brock villages, that the Brocks were first and the villages were appended in areas where village-like settlement was facilitated by that deepening of the social pyramid that I've suggested happened on the East Coast. Yeah, I think that'll do it. Let me just see if there's anything else here that I want to talk about and that we need to talk about. There's my Brock, pretty much. Okay. We have got there. We've got there at long last. That's part 1 of Brocks. Part 2 will follow tomorrow, after I've had a good night's sleep. Thank you.